Hello everyone. Today let me have a discussion on the poetry of the Victorian period. Victorian poetry. We know that the Victorian poetry falls under the two major poetic periods. One is the Romanticism, which precedes Victorian period, and the Modernist poetry, which comes after it. So normally the critics and readers would have a tendency to consider Victorian poetry either as away from romantic poetry or towards modernist poetry. However, looking at the Victorian poetry either as away from romantic poetry or towards modern poetry wouldn't be sufficient, because Victorian poetry has its own ways of addressing social issues and poetic sensibilities, and they were also engaged with addressing complex and innovative ways with the same issues of subjectivity and individuality that preoccupied generations before. And we can find some major Victorian poets. The major Victorian poets were renowned poets. For example, Alfred Lord Tennyson was a very foremost poet during this period, and we have the poets like Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Matthew Arnold, and towards the end of it we can see the emerging poetic traditions of W.B. Yeats. He may be later categorized as a 20th century poet as well. So the major poet during this period is Lord Alfred Tennyson. Was born in 1809 and died in 1892. He was the poet laureate of Britain during this period, Victorian period. And we can find his major poems like poems chiefly lyrical, published in 1830, characterized by the intense emotions and etc. Then we can find the poems like The Princess, a medley, published in the 1840s, trying to capture the social realities of the period, especially the issues of women's lack of access to higher education. But in the poem is going back to the medieval part in order to talk about this issue. Then we have one of the most prominent poem by Tennyson is In Memoriam, AHH, written for his friend Arthur Henry Hallam. And it is a very long poem. In fact, Queen Victoria compared it to the Bible for its consolatory powers, and it is a poem with 133 lyrics with the various topics, including the function of poetry writing, challenges to beliefs posed by scientific knowledge, man's relationship to nature, differences between qualitative and quantitative experience of time, etc. So we can see that it's an extended meditation on questions of truth, doubt, belief, faith and knowledge. Again, we can find some other poems, very famous poems by Tennyson, like Idylls of the King, Ulysses, very famous. Ulysses is there. During this period we can see the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It's a very prominent artistic movement with a group of painters and poets and sculptors joining together with certain views. And this pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood has also influenced the poetry of the period. It was formed in 1848. Some of the members of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood include John Everett Millais, William Michael Rossetti and Dante Gabriel Rossetti and their sister Christina Rossetti, James Collinson, Thomas Ulner, Ford Maddox Brown, William Holman Hunt, etc. They have a commitment to the close study of nature. They hark back to the earlier Italian Renaissance painting and inspired from medieval artistry. And they have their journal called The Germ. And this pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood must have influenced the poets to question the authority. And another prominent poet of this period is Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was born in 1806 and died in 1861, who she has appropriated the sonnet tradition, something like a sonnet is always been a male dominated poetic form, and she has incorporated it into a female, she has given a female voice to this type of poetry. And we can see the poems like The Cry of the Children, The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, Kazagiti Windows, etc. And Robert Browning, a very famous poet, who is known for his type of poetry called dramatic monologue. He was born in 1812 and died in 1889. He was the proponent, even before Robert Browning we can find the dramatic monologue type of poems, but he had popularized this type of poetry. He had published books like Dramatic Lyrics 1842, Men and Women 1855, and most of his poems like Andrea del Sarto, Fra Lippo, Child Roland, My Last Duchess, Soliloquies of the Spanish Cloister. These are all most anthologized poems in English literature itself. Another prominent poet of this period is Matthew Arnold, a poet critic. He may have one of the earliest proponents of the cultural criticism. He was also a very famous poet. He was born in 1822 and died in 1888. Most important poems: Dover Beach, The Scarlet Gypsy, Sorat and Rustum, and he was famous for his critical works like The Culture and Anarchy. Then he had published a lyrical drama titled The Stray Reveller, and a dramatic narrative, The Sick King of Bukhara. Then somewhat in the last period of the century we can find a group of poets like Yellow Book poets, Algernon, Charles Swinburne, Arthur Symons, Max Beetham, Joy Gissing, etc. and the grouping called Yellow Books poets. And later in 1890 we can find Rhymers Club, started by W.B. Yeats and Ernest Rice, in which Lionel Johnson, Ernest Dowson, Francis Thompson, Richard Lee Gallieni, John Gray, these were the very prominent poets. And during this period, one of the another feature of Victorian poetry is kind of long narrative poems, with which reminds us of novels. For example, Robert Browning published The Ring and the Book, Tennyson's Idylls of the King, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. These are all long narrative poems that published during this period. So these are some of the major figures and some of the major poems published in the Romantic period. The Victorian England, Victorian period, Victorian poetry. Okay, thank you. Bye.